Just two words of caution before I begin. Meera asked me not to be personal at this event. It is probably the stupidest request she has ever made of me. This is going to be deeply personal, and I may cry at any point. Talking about Sunil's death or HD's life can make anyone cry. If I do, please do not touch me, especially you, PK, as I do not like being touched, whether or not I am crying. Just ride it out. Wait till I finish crying and I begin reading again. We need to learn slowness, patience, and the ability to cry in academic talks, not just laugh or snigger. I was once at a talk by Professor Gillian Beer, one of my icons at Cambridge, and it was on Sylvia Townsend Warner and the Second World War. And it reminded her of her own childhood as a little child in war-bombed London, and she choked on tears. And a Britisher choking on tears is a sight to behold. And then she just stopped for a bit, collected herself, and began again. That's what I'll do if I cry. If we can cry at Hindustani classical vocal concerts, why not at English academic talks? Sunil, after all, was one for slowness and patience and the gradual gathering of things or ideas together, finally, after many Thumri-like interpretations. This intro is also going to be slightly long. Bear with me. I first met Sunil Dua somewhere around 1999 when I had just moved to Delhi after my PhD in England. He taught here in Hindu College, and I across the road in the world's most corrupt, sick and unchristian institution, St. Stephen's College. I was, I am ashamed to say, not impressed by him at all. He struck me as a faded watercolor. I was a Bombay girl, and I knew nothing about Punjabis or Delhi or North India. But as I was later to learn, he was no representative of the Punjabi male of the species. Usually tall, strapping, and with a penis leaping out of one's mouth, Sunil was a far cry from the Punjabi male, though he was a Punjabi who lived in Derawal Nagar. It should have been the first reason I was drawn to him, but I foolishly did not respect him for it at all. It was to be, in retrospect, the first of several misreadings of him by me, which cost me what might have been one of the most valued and valuable friendships. As I got to know him and his batch, I discovered he was the only one who had not found a woman yet among all his heterosexual batchmates, and he was heterosexual. Jacob, PK, and that whole generation had been partnered, and so had the women, barring of course sensible ones like Deepika Tandon. So why had not Sunil? Why was he so low in the pecking order and so slow to join the Jane Austen show? This again should have been something that endeared me to him. However, it did not at the time. I of course did not buy the snide talk of his having dated every woman doing English in DU, including the goddess Venus herself, Nilofer Kaul, and along with Meera, his eventual partner, several batches his junior, I could not but exclaim, how could he have let Nilofer go? That he eventually chose Meera should have endeared me to him further. I had just met Meera in an MPhil class I taught on sexual dissidence, invited by the profoundly incompetent Sumanyu Satpathy, whose idea of queerness was his brushing against someone in a DTC bus and getting aroused only to find out it was a man. Welcome to the DU English department. And I found Meera utterly brilliant. She should have been teaching that class. I should have commended Sunil for his choice. Instead, I scoffed at her for hers. I have very high standards for my female friends, especially if they are as brilliant as Meera and as beautiful. Arvind Thomas, her classmate, rightly called her back in 2000 a pre-Raphaelite painting. Arvind, like all the men of her batch, was felled by Meera's beauty and intimidated by her brilliance. Meera was my icon. She was a diva. What was she doing with this man on a simmer flame? It led to my first fight with Meera, and not the last. Tired of my ribbing her over her choice of man, she wrote me an irate email in her characteristically exquisite English turn of phrase. I backed off. More recently, she told me, you should have trusted me, Ashley, to have chosen only the best. I should have. My third misreading of Sunil was his refusal to publish or climb the academic ladder. Madhavi told me Jacob and she had to yank him by the hair to a refresher course to ensure that he was paid commensurably with his experience. Sunil did not care about publishing, refresher courses and arrears, and now Meera has to suffer for it. But I should have respected him for all that. Those refusals are brilliant in a dog-eat-dog, capitalist, sick, mediocre academic world. I respected myself for not caring either, so why did I not respect Sunil for it? My fourth misreading of him was as a teacher. He was arguably the most devoted and amazing undergraduate teacher any DU English department has ever seen. I respected teachers who did that across the country and in DU. The redoubtable Sharada Nair from LSR, for example. Teachers who spent their entire lives teaching in the classroom, day in and day out, with an indefatigable passion and commitment. And if his students' testimonies are to be paid any attention, you will know that Sunil was an amazing teacher. Yet when Priyam, this little Assamese girl now doing her PhD in Germany who adored him, would come to D school after a lecture on Beckett by Sunil and tell me how amazing he was, I, teaching at KMC or MH or Ramjas or some nightmarish place, would only say, "Pah, why does he not publish? Where's the evidence of this genius? I don't buy it." It was so utterly stupid of me. My fifth misreading of Sunil was how amazing he was as a friend and as a lover to those he saw as friends and lovers. He was such a woman, patient, listening, loyal, and woman-identified, unlike his dyed-in-the-wool hetero friends. That's PK's phrase, for example, about himself, vomit, vomit. Like PK, Jacob, and all the other men of his generation, and later generations, Meera's generation, Prashant, Kishore, Nikhil, vomit, vomit. Awful, hard, male-identified men whose coldness made me afraid of them, and I lurched towards the women, Madhavi, Karen, Nilofer, Meera, Ananya, all much nicer people, as all women are compared to all men. Yes, hashtag all men. Even when these women identified, or women even, who are often male identified, as many of them were, I see Meera as half male identified at any rate. They were women nevertheless with warm hearts and emotions. They engaged with me and took to me as a gay man. But Sunil was one of the women. I never felt I had to run away from him. I never saw any homophobia or hardness or even indifference in him. He was a woman, and I did not even see it. I remember that afternoon he called some of us to his warm home in Deraval Nagar. I later was to learn that this darbar was a tradition, gave us tea and pakoras, and listened to each one of us, talking to me without flinching and without sentimentality, but with a warmth that radiated from him about his mentally ill brother, and I talked about my mentally ill mother. I still believe Meera was among us there, but she says she was not. Prasida, whom he also dated for a bit, was definitely there. I remember him sitting in the background of that god-awful McDonald's that used to be down the road here, looking after a very little and playful Sumaira, as Meera and I, well, mainly I, bitched about everything and everybody in DU. Where does one find such a man, such a father, such a lover? I should have reached out to him across those shitty chairs in that shitty McDonald's and asked him to be my friend. He could not be my lover, he was straight, but who knows? I underestimate my seductive abilities. Instead, I just watched him from the corner of my eye, as did Meera, deeply appreciative, happy for Meera. I told her as much. She smiled. I could go on, but what's the point? Sunil is gone, and I lost a friend I never had to begin with. I want to now write a book about Sunil Dua. Every now and then Meera tells me something new about him, and he startles me. He surprises me from wherever he is, wryly smiling as usual, that shitty cigarette dangling from his lips, as usual. How lost he looked without that cigarette in the last 10 years. It was his only stab at Tashan, at swag. Think of the handsome Camus with his cigarette. My book on Sunil will invert the title of the first volume of the French writer Hervé Guibert's terrifyingly beautiful autobiographical trilogy, which is about his friend Michel Foucault, called Musil, that other great male modernist, Robert Musil, in the novel. Guibert's novel is called À l'ami qui qui ne m'a pas sauvé la vie in its title. In English, to the friend who did not save my life. My title of the Sunil book would be to the friend whose life I did not save. À l'ami dont je n'ai pas sauvé la vie. Though Sunil was exactly my age, both of us were born in 1969, both of us proud to have been born in the year Woodstock happened, and not older as Foucault was in relation to Guibert. I should have slapped those cigarettes out of his mouth. I should have made him write essays, twisting his ears as he did it. I did none of it. I was never close enough to him to be able to. Till I write the book then, I must make do with dedicating my textbook on modernism to Sunil. It's available here. Do buy it. It's dedicated to him. And dedicate this Sunil Dua Memorial Lecture to him. Meera erroneously believes that a memorial lecture must engage with or commemorate the work of the person being memorialized. In fact, it is merely a lecture devoted to the memory of a person, is usually on the speaker's own research, and the speaker merely nods to the person whose name the lecture is instituted, sometimes someone he or she has never met. But my lecture is actually in engagement with Sunil. Like all his heterosexual friends, even if, as I have claimed, Sunil was actually a woman, Sunil was largely a male-identified teacher and reader, indeed like many women. Camus and Beckett were his heroes, not Woolf and Gaudemer. So I chose a woman poet, my favorites, H.D. Wondering what to choose to speak on about her, given how varied H.D.'s concerns are and how large her corpus. She wrote over 60 years of just incredible amounts of writing. What would I speak on? Meera, again, unwittingly and inadvertently came to my rescue. Meera is always coming to my rescue. On the phone, she said to me, he did love and read classical women in response to my calling him male-identified. So he was not all male-identified, she added, always one for fairness and balance. That did it for me. I chose classical women as my focus for this lecture, though neither Sunil nor I knew any Greek. Or maybe he did. He was an autodidact in many ways, but I certainly don't have any Greek. H.D. did, along with several other languages, including French and Italian. I used to call Meera the Madame Bovary of DU, chastising her for not doing her PhD and not taking research seriously, despite being the most brilliant woman I know in DU. But Meera was and is actually not Madame Bovary, but H.D., the H.D. of DU, bisexual, brilliant, and madly in love with her own Richard Aldington, who was Sunil Dua, though unlike Aldington, and this is important to note, unlike Aldington, Sunil never betrayed her. Meera said to me over WhatsApp that if Sunil saw the poster of the third Sunil Dua Memorial Lecture being delivered by Ashley fucking Tellis, well, she didn't use fucking, he would have rolled his eyes. He thought you hated him, or at least disliked him, she wrote. He was both right and wrong. I did not hate him. He was too kind to be hated by anybody. I did dislike him. I wanted more from him. But that is because I did not know him, and I was so utterly wrong about what I thought I knew about him. He was enough and more than enough of a person. Who he was, as one of his students put it on Facebook, was as plain to see as sunlight with a man reading in it. I could not see what was in plain sight. I was, as I say, stupid. What matters though is that Sunil was happy. Happy with Meera, happy with Sumaira, with his students, happy discussing Camus and Beckett. Like Camus, he reveled in the absurd. That was life. He died, as the title of one of Camus' books says, La mort heureuse, a happy death. These words then are for Sunil, the friend I never had. and whose life I did not save. It is strange to begin a friendship with someone after they have died. But today is the first day of my real friendship with Sunil. But it is better late than never. And these words are for Meera, the friend I do have. And in whom Sunil lives every painful day of her life, reminding her, yes, of the horror of loss, but also of the beauty of love and the absurdity of the world in Camus' incredible sense of the absurd. That was the intro. Now for the lecture. He always does, always, unfailingly. Maybe when I read Eurydice, it will happen, but not for now. So the paper is called, Why is it always a girl who had died? HD and classical women. The quote is from HD. She was a woman who wondered when she read literature, why are all the women dying? And not just in the classical world, but right down to the 19th century novel and even later. Okay, here goes. I hate biography type introductions to authors in talks or published essays, but at least two of my ex-students, both English honors, both from Ramjas, I'll have you know, whom I sent this poster of this talk to, sent me WhatsApp messages asking me, what is HD? And at least one of them was a brilliant student. So I am sure there are idiots among you not familiar with who HD was. And how might I blame you or students in DU when the DU syllabus has only men, Yeats, Eliot, Arne, in the modernist poetry syllabus even in 2022. Welcome to the Indian university where feminism has not yet happened. And the rewriting of the canon is merely some so-called post-colonial shit by mediocre brown and black monkeys from all over, writing crap as they drink gaumutra and eat bananas and feed them to their simian friends on the ridge, and for whom HD is a type of TV screen. And the evacuation of the English canon, that's what we're all facing today, right? Truly, this course should have been renamed, the English Honours course in Delhi should be renamed what Delhi folk call the Bharmapuri BA, and we in Bombay called Ragadapuri, and not Honours in English Literature. So here goes. Robert Babcock, I wonder if he's related to the marvelous Barbara Babcock, who introduced the University of Arizona, where I did my postdoc, to cultural studies, and whose corner of the campus office building I was also housed in during my postdoc at the University of Arizona in 2003. She never came to office. The U of A had treated her so badly that she became hopelessly reclusive. But I matha tekoed at her door every morning. Yet another woman whom nobody but her devoted students and colleagues knows and remembers. Like Stephen Heath in Cambridge, that other heterosexual man who, like Sunil Dua, is a woman and who never publishes anymore for 20 years now, wounded into silence by the shitty Cambridge University department and what they did to his friend Colin McCabe, and to the truly brilliant reformulation of the canon, unlike our reformulation of the canon that McCabe and Heath and others were working on in Cambridge from the late 60s onwards, thanks to Raymond Williams. But that's another story, another wounding of another set of English professors. Anyway, Robert Babcock has a marvelous introduction to HD in his book review of Eileen Gregory's book, HD and Hellenism, which I once browsed through while I was in the Cambridge University Library, or the UL as it is fondly called, in the late 90s. It is a Cambridge University Press book after all, but I can't find anywhere in India. I could not find it for this lecture, could not even find it online in 2022. Welcome to neoliberal India and its utter failure to get even capitalism, which it so admires, right. I found this entry, however, on the Bryn Mawr website. And I'm going to read that entry to you for those of you who don't know who HD is. Babcock writes, and I'm quoting it at length, although her later work, culminating in the epic length Helen in Egypt, 1961, continued its extraordinary dialogue with classical literature and continued to attract the attention of critics of American poetry, particularly since the late 1960s, HD was the founder of Imagism, a friend, collaborator, or associate of a host of modernist writers, including Ezra Pound, to whom she was at one time betrothed. William Carlos Williams, D.H. Lawrence, Winifred Breyer, her lover for over 40 years, Richard Oldington, her lover for thankfully a much shorter period of time, Marion Moore, one of her classmates at Bryn Mawr. She was one of the greatest writers about cinema, an annals hand of Freud in Vienna, an eyewitness to and survivor of the bombing of London, and a chronicler through her poetry of both world wars. For these reasons and many others besides, H.D. has attracted the attention of 20th century critics of various persuasions, and she has won widespread recognition for her work, including being the first woman to be honored with the award of Merit Medal for Poetry by the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So that's the intro for those of you who don't know H.D. On the theme of this lecture, that is on classical women and H.D., Babcock writes, all scholars of H.D.'s work, whatever their theoretical bent, acknowledge, as did Fairclough, the first critic to write on H.D.'s Hellenism, the overwhelming importance of ancient Greece in H.D.'s poetry. Her subjects, vocabulary, settings and themes come from Greek literature, history, art and archaeology. She alludes to, quotes from, responds to and adapts and translates from a wide range of Greek writers including Homer, Sappho, Euripides, Anacreon, Theocrates, the Greek anthology and Pausanias. She read classical scholarship from Wilimowitz's On Greek Historical Writing to the 5 volumes of Farnell's Cults of the Greek States, which she owned and annotated throughout. She visited Greek, Roman and Egyptian museums, cities and archaeological sites, mostly with her female lover, Breyer. The last 30 years have seen an enormous increase in scholarly attention to H.D. and her work, especially from scholars of feminism, race and gender studies, film studies, psychoanalytical criticism and many other disciplines. And I'm going to contest this feminist revision of H.D. in the 1970s, saying they simply don't get H.D.'s brilliance. A search for her name in the MLA database produces more than 450 publications about her since 1970. But strangely, H.D. is still largely ignored by professional classicists. This recent deluge of scholarly writing about her work is ample testimony that her poetry is worth reading, end quote. On the book he is reviewing, that is Eileen's book, the one I couldn't find in India, Babcock writes, Eileen Gregory brilliantly demonstrates that the experience is richer and more attractive for those who understand her Greek world the best. H.D. and Hellenism is groundbreaking as a study of the transmission and influence of classical literature in American poetry. It addresses the classical background of H.D.'s work. Gregory has few predecessors. In addressing the classical background of H.D.'s work, Gregory has few predecessors. The first monographic study of H.D. was also the first extensive treatment of the influence of classical sources on her work. Thomas Burnett Swan's The Classical World of H.D., published in 1962. Swan freely admits that he is unable to judge her translations, not knowing the classical languages, like me. He turned to H.D. herself for assistance in identifying allusions or sources that escaped him, including Cimethea, the enchantress of Theocritus' second idyll. But one cannot quibble with Swan's delicate appreciation of H.D.'s poetry, and one would still today gladly give his book to an undergraduate looking for an orientation to H.D.'s Greece. Like Swan, Eileen Gregory is a professor of English, not of Greek, but her study is in a different class altogether from Swan's. It is, in the first place, informed by the voluminous recent scholarship about H.D.'s writing that was unavailable to Swan. So it is much more sophisticated and far more insightful in its analysis of her poems. Gregory is also much more systematic and comprehensive in identifying H.D.'s Greek sources, literary and artistic, and in tracing the transmission of her sources through intermediaries that colored H.D.'s appreciation or understanding of the Greek original. And this is the first point I want to make about H.D., that H.D.'s was not some Eliot-like, and this encyclopedia entry that I'm going to quote from a little later keeps talking about how, like Eliot, she believes in a kind of objective correlative, which is in traditional and individual talent, for those of you doing the third year English honors, which is in this textbook. Or, for example, that her vision of cohesion is like Eliot's, and it's bullshit. It's nothing like Eliot's. H.D.'s is a systematic feminist revision of the classical. Eliot's is simply a cleaving to it. Eliot is an asshole, in effect. and HD is not. Gregory has carefully sifted the books that were, and Eliot was a fascist, HD is not. HD stopped talking to Pound when he turned fascist. Let us not forget. Pound, who was her lover, her best friend, she met him when she was 15. Gregory has carefully sifted the books that were once in HD's library, now housed in the Beinecke Library at Yale, especially her editions and translations of Greek authors, paying particular attention to the ones in which HD wrote notes or comments. Gregory also points to the scholarly works that HD cited, especially Farnell, but also to the influence of the Hellenists of the Victorian age, in particular Wilde, Swinburne, Fraser, Symonds, Pater. And she is especially informative on the influence of Jane Ellen Harrison and the Cambridge anthropologists. She further investigates popular and non-literary sources of HD's vision of Greece, opera, astronomy, psychoanalysis, guidebooks for her travels through Greece and Egypt, newspaper accounts of the campaigns of Gallipoli, etc. In pages that should interest all classicists, her first chapter, it should interest all third-year English honors students too, Gregory describes the construct of classical in early Anglo-American modernism, quoting Hume, Pound, and T.S. Eliot, of course, that great classical male asshole troika on the subject. She elaborates Eliot's model of Hellenism and HD's rejection of that model. This is the point, exemplified in her preference for Euripides over Eliot's Aeschylus. Devotees of the debate surrounding Bernal's Black Athena will find much of interest in Gregory's study. Gregory provides clear evidence that HD perceived of academic classicists in her day as narrowing the focus of ancient studies and the canon of ancient authors by emphasizing writers who were male, heterosexual, Eurocentric, militaristic, and patriotic. Eliot was none of these things. We clearly need to send a copy of HD to Narendra Modi, but never mind. It may surprise some contemporary classicists to learn that HD, a woman writing during the period when this narrowing was supposedly taking place, not only recognized the trend towards Aryanizing the canon, Aryanizing, blink, blink, that Bernal describes, but associated it not as he did with German nationalism, but with English academics, all of us. We are the real fascists, actually. And HD reacted, and with English academics and with T.S. Eliot, HD reacted strongly to this trend by developing her own canon of writers. Her unpublished essays, notes on Euripides, Pausanias, and Greek lyric poets, as well as the work she refers to in her poetry and novels, define an alternative canon. Gregory has much to say about HD's chosen authors, especially the extent to which they represent an Alexandrian curriculum in the late Romantic and decadent sense. Gregory quotes Oscar Wilde on the subject. There is really not a single form that art now uses that does not come to us from the critical spirit of Alexandria, where these forms were either stereotyped or invented or made perfect. It was to that city and not to Athens that Rome turned. A translation of Greek culture from Athens to Egypt. It's a bit like Said's rereading of Freud and Freud's Moses and monotheism from the Egyptian context. This is HD's brilliance that no one has paid attention to, shockingly, till 2022. A translation of Greek culture from Athens to Egypt, a fruitful mingling of Asian and European, of pagan, Christian, and Jewish, and especially a distinct feminine tradition in literature. End quote. Okay, so that's enough of a background to HD and Hellenism. What am I contributing to this scholarship in this paper without any Greek and not a quarter of HD's scholarship? I mean, I'm terrified of HD. I'm just going to read a couple of poems with you, hopefully collaboratively with you. You will read them with me, perhaps instruct me on them. I mean, there's Meera here, there's PK here, there's all kinds of bright people here, there's Nora here. Karen is missing, I want to slap her really hard. Anyway, just readings of a couple of poems that made me cry every time I read them. They make me cry. But not before I quote the rest of Babcock's review, which is a call for more HD scholarship. And this is directed only at Meera, whom I want to do her PhD and on HD. And of course, knowing Meera, she'll only do what she wants to do. But never mind, I'll still try. Maybe it will trigger some student here as well, sitting here, to work on HD and to learn Greek, to revisit HD. I already asked Asif Khan, a beautiful boy I met while doing invigilating in some shitty exam in the NCWEB in Jesus and Mary in May, while looking at his toes, his face was too beautiful to look at. Let's see if he does that PhD. Here's Babcock again. For future directions in the research of HD, Gregory could have gone even further in describing HD's canon as a coherent and to HD's mind comprehensive survey of Greek literature. For it is just as interesting to consider what HD did not read as what she did. She threw out the Iliad in favor of the Odyssey. She was, like Joyce, under the spell of Samuel Butler's authoress of the Odyssey. Archaic lyric for HD is represented by Sappho, not Alcaeus. For tragedy, she read Euripides. She calls him feminine, as I call Sunil, not Sophocles or Aeschylus. For history, she went to Pausanias. She believed he was Jewish, not Herodotus or Thucydides. In lyric poetry, she chose Anacreon. She thought he was Asian. Theocritus, he lived in and wrote about Egypt and the Greek anthology. She believed Meleager was Jewish. Plato is an author of love lyrics in the Greek anthology. The Trojan War is not about Achilles and Hector, but about Helen. She wrote a book called Helen in Egypt. An astounding book. I've read it about 25 times. I don't claim to understand a word. HD elaborates in her early lyrics, in her essay on Euripides' Helen, and in her final work, Helen in Egypt, the palinode of Stesichorus about Helen's abduction to Egypt. The extent of HD's assimilation of Helen to an Egyptian, that is a non-European, and Alexandrian, that is a decadent context, is inadvertently revealed in the first draft of the typescript of her essay on Euripides' Helen, preserved in the HD archive at Yale, in which every time she meant to write Menelaus, she instead wrote Meleager. Euripides, as Gregory amply shows, her entire 6 chapters devoted to him, was the most influential Greek author in HD's canon. Gregory documents HD's engagement with Euripides in her lyrics, novels, and narrative poems, and she makes extensive use of HD's unpublished essays, the notes on Euripides, Pausanias, and Greek lyric poets, the bulk of which are devoted to Euripides. HD owned and annotated editions of Euripides in Greek, English, and French. Mira already speaks French. HD owned and annotated editions of Euripides in these languages. Her translations from the choruses of Euripides earned grudging and paternalistic praise from none other than T.S. Eliot, who preferred HD's renditions to Gilbert Murray's. Must we touch Eliot's feet in thanksgiving? There is much more to be done with HD and her Greek world than anyone could have done in one volume. In particular, HD's lifelong engagement with Euripides is fertile territory. The appendices and indices to Gregory's volume are intended to provide a sound basis for further work in studying her classical background. And Gregory's text should provide a sufficient orientation in the complexities and richness of HD's poetry and contemporary criticism of it to prevent a too hasty approach by classicist source hunters. We don't want those. Therefore, we want Mira. Classicists who are interested in the transmission and influence of classical literature in American poetry could hardly ask for a more appealing poet than HD or a better introduction to her work than Gregory's, end quote. Now for my readings. But not before I talk. I have enough time. I'm timing myself. But we have till 3:30. It's only 2:30. We have an hour for discussion and talk. And my readings are pedestrian, I must inform you right now. But before I start my readings, I want to talk about these beautiful posters that my gay painter friend, and it is important to mention that he is gay, as you will learn in a moment, Sutanu Panigrahi, an Odia boy. Well, he's almost my age, but to me he is and will always remain a boy, a beautiful, beautiful boy whom I met in People Tree. He makes all the t-shirts, and he used to make all the t-shirts in People Tree, all the block prints, all the paintings, all the sketches, somewhere around 1999, the same time I first met Sunil. This is the poster he made for me. When I sent him the poster details, he asked me for some information on HD to be able to make the poster. He also didn't know HD. He hasn't done a PA in English literature. He read it and was deeply moved. Remembered that he had read some of her poems somewhere. He never studied literature, he never went to college at all. And he came up with this poster. the bit from the Poetry Foundation entry, which is what I sent him, that inspired this poster is this, and I quote, "HD found the stimulation that led to an artistic identity in her personal relationships outside the family and classroom. Most important among her friends were Ezra Pound, William Carlos, this is the Poetry Foundation entry, William Carlos Williams and Frances Josepha Gregg, her first female lover, who betrayed her in a long line of betraying lovers. She met Pound when she was 15. By 1903, Pound and Williams, both students at the University of Pennsylvania, visited the observatory on Sunday afternoons. What comes through Williams's ambivalent descriptions of Hilda, that's her real name by the way, Hilda Doolittle, she hated it. What comes through Williams's ambivalent, it's such a 19th century name, she said, I can't stand this name. What comes through Williams's ambivalent descriptions of Hilda in his autobiography is the image of an intense young woman seeking to step outside the confinement of Victorian conventions. Williams was fascinated by her provocative indifference to rule and order. She started to write poems, she told him, by splashing ink from her pen all over her clothes to give her a feeling of freedom and indifference. She wandered in the woods and fields, climbed fences, and once startled Williams by the ecstatic abandon with which she embraced a summer storm. So Sutanu found Victorian fabric and splashed ink on it. That's his tribute to HD. I love the poster. Anyway, you see now why Meera is DU's HD. There is no one I know more than Meera who doesn't give or who has indifference to rule and order, and also who would embrace a summer storm. There are other uncanny parallels between Meera's life and HD's, but I won't embarrass her with them. Read the Poetry Foundation entry. It's Meera all over. Anyway, Sutanu's poster then is Victorian fabric he found and splashed ink on. It is a woman-identified gay man's tribute to HD, and it is amazing, like everything Sutanu does. Now for my readings. Initially, I wanted to do a reading from that brilliant late book by HD, the 1961 book, Helen in Egypt. But as I told you, that incredible text is intimidating beyond belief. Here once again is the entry from the Poetry Foundation on Helen in Egypt. This is just to tantalize you, to make you want to go and read Helen in Egypt. It's available on LibGen. Go and read it. This is what the Poetry Foundation entry on it says. Helen in Egypt weaves together in an extraordinary fashion the various strands of HD's imaginative and relational life for the previous 40 years. Along with Trilogy, these 3 novels she wrote, it is recognized by many as her greatest achievement, the culmination of the broad-ranging philosophical and aesthetic concerns that had consumed her after World War I. The epic, based on obscure variants of Greek myth, is unconventional in its handling of chronology, situation, and narrative. It takes place shortly after the end of the Trojan War and centers on the post-war destinies of Helen and Achilles, but in the palimpsest of history, that beautiful word, palimpsest, things written upon each other, HD's favorite metaphor for time. The epic is all about time, about all time, all war, and all love. The epic also embodies the patterns of HD's life, the Dryad's early love for Pound, Helen Dendritus, and Paris, HD's soldier lovers, Oldington, and on another level, Dowding, Achilles, the shattering impact of the war, and her androgynous analyst, Freud, Theseus in the book. As Rachel Blau Duplessis and Gelpi have shown, HD's memoirs of the 1950s, such as the unpublished Thorn Thicket, written in 1960, and the Hearst-Landon notebooks, identify the casts, but it is essential to avoid biographical reductionism and to focus instead on the creative mind of the artist who transforms the raw material of her personal life and cultural myth into a unique text. This is my second point. Never ever read HD biographically. I mean, it's very tempting. She had a crazy, crazy life. She slept with men, she slept with women, men betrayed her, women betrayed her. She thought she was going to be with this woman married. She thought she was going to be with this man, the man married. Pound married, other men married. She found other women, she went traveling with women. She got pregnant. The doctors told her that she and the child were both going to die. They were going to die that very night. She survived. The child survived. The child is called Perdita. She travels for the next 30 years with Perdita and her female lover, Briar. I mean, what kind of life is this? And she doesn't ever marry. All her lesbian lovers are marrying. Briar married, I don't know how many men, to protect HD. This is what women had to do. To protect your female lover, you marry a man, to show the world that this is not a lesbian relationship. I mean, this life, it's a Hindi film, multiplied by 10. But avoid the life is what I'm saying. That's my second point, which a lot of feminists didn't avoid. And I'm saying, avoid that life. It's too dramatic. It's too exciting. That's one reason. But the real reason is this, what I just read from this entry. She transforms the raw material of her life and cultural myth into a unique text. And it's not, I don't like this word unique text. It's shitty and adjectively empty, into a political text. It's a bit like Sylvia Plath's poem Daddy, which turns her father into Hitler. That's important. Jacqueline Rose defends that choice. Many people attacked Plath for it because Plath wasn't a Jew. But Jacqueline Rose defends it, saying this is a political reading. You have to understand that political reading. You can't reduce it to Ted Hughes or her own absentee father. Yes, it's Ted Hughes, and yes, it's her absentee father, but yes, it's also Hitler. And it's a poem about complicity. It's a poem about how we love Hitler. Such a poem, you know, like the secular leftists among us, these idiots who think that just calling Modi a fascist or saying we're living in fascist times is a form of critique. No, I think the first form of critique we have to identify is our own investment in that fascist. My poem about Modi is how I'm in love with Modi, how I'm in love with that chest, how I'm in love with that kind of alpha man. It's important to recognize that complicity, and that's what HD does right through. Who's her best friend? Remember, through the 1920s and 30s, it's Lawrence. And she recognizes in Lawrence, we all dismiss Lawrence today as some kind of like crazy essentialist. So did HD. She critiqued him for her, what she calls his man-woman thing. But she sees in him an ability to get at the gut of what we are actually doing, what our psyches are doing as men and women. Therefore, she likes him. She likes Pound, and she takes a stand on Pound once Pound turns fascist. And she stops talking to him. She re-talks to him later in old age, when Pound is grown old and somewhat sensible. And then she writes books about that relationship from when she was 15 to her old age. It's an extraordinary life. I mean, and what I'm saying is that HD was committed to nothing, no man, no woman, as much as she was committed to poetry. And that's my point, and that's why I chose her for Sunil Dua. Sunil Dua was committed to teaching more than anything else. And that's what makes them similar. Echoing Homer's Odyssey and Iliad, HD's text, both, I'm still reading the Poetry Foundation entry on Helen in Egypt. HD's text, Helen in Egypt, both uses and dramatically revises the masculine epic tradition. I don't like these lines again. I don't think HD is about, that's why I don't like the second wave feminist critics. They just call her feminine. They call, you know, Pound. The famous moment in HD's life, in case you don't know it, is Pound scribbling across her manuscript, HD, imagiste. And all these critics, second wave critics, like Sandra Guba, whom I fondly call Sandra Gober, basically say, oh, this is the male rewriting the woman and destroying her. Nonsense. She appreciated it tremendously. She was terribly grateful to Pound. She hated Hilda Doolittle. And Pound loved her poetry and sent it to Monroe saying, this woman is the real imagiste. And she was. And so I don't see Pound as a masculine overwriting of her at all. Gober is wrong. But anyway, rewriting of the masculine blah blah epic tradition. Her epic is also about the Trojan War and its aftermath. However, HD moves the epic's traditional focus of the masculine hero, blah blah, by making Helen, this is the point, the center of consciousness, adapting the associational processes of both psychoanalysis and the modernist novel of consciousness. She loved Woolf. HD's epic creates a multi-layered narrative whose emphasis is on an inner journey, not external action. The epic's free associational movement is carefully structured, however. There are three main parts to Helen's story: Palinode, Leuke, and Eidolon. I'm sure I'm pronouncing all these Greek words wrong. The first two parts contain 7 books, while the last part has 6 books. Each book in turn contains 8 sections. As the key unit of the epic's organization, each section consists of a prose introduction and a differing number of mainly 3-line, unrhymed but musically resonant stanzas. Rhyme appears occasionally with an incantational effect for special emphasis. When Pearson arranged for her to record parts of the verse sections in 1955, H.D. developed prose introductions for each section, and at Pearson's urging, she wrote prose introductions for all the remaining sections and incorporated them into the final text. These double voices linguistically highlight a philosophical pattern in her whole oeuvre, the desire to explore, represent, and ultimately transcend duality. And I disagree completely with this. This is my third point of my talk. I don't think that H.D. was about transcending duality at all. H.D. was about recognizing that, this one student came to me and asked me, what is my preferred pronoun? I wanted to vomit. We can't decide our pronouns. These are decided for us. Sexual difference is what Freud calls a principle. It's not a law, it's a principle. It's the principle of the psyche. You can't decide what your pronoun is and change that understanding of sexual difference. So I don't think H.D. is about transcending duality at all. H.D. is about recognizing duality and what duality does to the psyche, and how might one push it ever so little, ever so little. It's like what Juliet Mitchell says about Lacan. She says she doesn't like Lacan and prefers Freud because she has a lovely phrase. She says, in Lacan, the hand of the symbolic doesn't so much as twitch. What is the symbolic? The symbolic is that which determines us. We are all tied to the symbolic, the law of the father. In Lacan, we are doomed. It doesn't twitch. In Freud, it twitches. In the feminists who read Freud, it twitches. We can change a little. We can't rewrite it. We can't be Julia Kristeva or Luce Irigaray or Hélène Sixou, all these dumb French women, none of whom are actually French, but never mind. We can't be them to simply think we can have an alternative symbolic, a Cora, a pre-Oedipal symbolic. It doesn't work like that. You have to work with what you have in the material world, in the psychic world. You can't decide. It's not a sleight of hand. It's not a fiat of will that you can decide to change the symbolic. You can't decide I'm going to be non-binary. If you're non-binary, you're still in the fucking binary. You're defining yourself by the binary. How are you non-binary? It makes no sense. The epic begins, no, Helen in Egypt begins with the image of Helena, hated of all Greece. A Pandora who has brought death and destruction to victors and victims alike in the Trojan War. According to tradition, as the prose voice reminds us, Stesichorus and Euripides were punished by the gods for their early portraits of this evil, hated Helen, and subsequently wrote palinodes affirming her innocence. Zeus, as the variant myth has it, placed a phantom Helen upon the ramparts of Troy and kept the faithful wife safe in Egypt until Menelaus retrieved her. H.D.'s palinode revises the myth yet again by redefining the nature of Helen's innocence. H.D.'s Helen did indeed leave her husband and child and went to Troy with her lover Paris, but the weight of male hatred has caused her to repress the memory of that rebellion. Like the free associational, reflective and interpretative structure of H.D.'s analysis with Freud, Helen gradually peels back the layers of memory and family history to answer the question, Helena, who is she? The epic begins with Helen in Egypt searching the sacred hieroglyphs of the Ammon temple to understand why Zeus brought her to Egypt and to clarify her relation to the hated phantom of Helen. In the action that sets the epic in motion, Helen's power draws on the dead Achilles to her for the answers he might provide. Shipwrecked, lost, and limping from the fatal wound in his heel, Achilles shatters Helen's piece of certain innocence. When he recognizes the woman he used to watch in fascination and anger, he calls her Hecate, witch, and tries to strangle her. She appeals desperately to his mother, Thetis, the goddess of the sea. The name of the goddess recalls Achilles to a former self that knew nothing of killing, and his violence turns to love. The two lovers meet again to decipher their memories and the meaning of the past. Sounds like reconciliation, but is it? is it? We'll see that in the later poem. H.D.'s later poem is not a shitty Yeatsian poem about rape. It's a poem about reconciliation. But what is the nature of that reconciliation? It is not, I am arguing, the reconciliation of dualism. It is not. The two lovers meet again to decipher their memories and the meaning of the past. Palinode is a love story of sorts, but before the lovers can be united on the island of Leuce, as the variant myth has it, each must undertake a separate quest for identity. Achilles reflects on how his fatal glance at Helen of Troy led to his unfastened ankle grief and subsequent rebirth as the new mortal who has renounced the death cult of war. It's an anti-war poem. Helen learns that she herself is the writing. Please remember that phrase with HD. She herself is the writing, the hieroglyph that must be deciphered if she is to remember her earlier selves. Her meeting with Achilles, in which violence becomes love through the agency of Thetis, is the central hieroglyph to which she returns in reflection as the embodiment of fundamental truths about love and war, l'amour et la mort, eros and iris. Leuce and Eidolon are structured primarily by Helen's inner confrontation with the past. Narrative based on identifiable action is scanty and often like a dream sequence, like the fiction that H.D. loved by Dorothy Richardson. Dorothy Richardson's pilgrimage is 8 volumes long and nothing happens. As Leuce opens, a skiff brings Helen to the island, where she awakens not to Achilles, but to the memory of laughing joyfully with Paris, her lover. The alchemy of her memory draws Paris to her, and together they relive the years of their springtime love and the Trojan War. Helen refuses Paris's demand that she renounce Achilles, but is still torn by the conflict of selves. This suffering brings her baffled and tired to the home of Theseus, her first lover. Now an old man, he kindly helps Helen sort through the past to reconcile her fragmented selves. Eidolon recalls Helen's slow process of synthesizing dual selves in search for wholeness. Wrong, in my opinion, wrong reading. Her identification with Thetis, who embodies the mystical love of the Ketha heresy and Moravian mysticism, is key, as is her attempt to understand the dialectical interactions of love and war. Her union with Achilles and the birth of their androgynous child Euphorion takes place off stage and do not serve as the climax of the epic. Instead, the emphasis is on Helen's own sense of who she is. Helen, whether the hated phantom of Troy or the repressed woman of Egypt, has become the Helen of Troy, Egypt and Greece, who is at peace with a fully healed, conscious self. I disagree. Point 4, but it's the same as point 3's disagreement. Helen's self-acceptance and self-creation are made possible by a series of reflections on love and war as embodied in myth and history, ideas which taken together constitute a critique of patriarchy. This I agree with. Aware of Pound's fascism in the cantos, H.D. created a counter voice in her cantos that saw the world divided into the forces of love and life in opposition to the forces of war and death. Eros over Thanatos. Yes, that is H.D. The Seymour exhibition down the road needs to learn from her. As H.D. revised both Freud and the esoteric tradition, Eros is for Freud, it's the dead drive in the end. He's a pessimistic man at the end of his life. The Second World War, he dies on the eve of the Second World War. It's going to happen. He writes to Einstein saying, it's going to happen. Stop with your science, physicists, happy, clappy, hippie shit. It's not going to stop the war. It's going to happen. He's a sad, broken man at the end of his life, Sigmund Freud. But H.D. is rewriting Freud. Thanatos is the force of death epitomized by the fascistic command. Let us not name the current fascistic command under Achilles' leadership. Let us not name Achilles in this room. And the death cult at the heart of the purely masculine ironing. Look at that phrase by H.D. The masculine ironing of war. It reminds me of Virginia Woolf's extraordinary metaphor in Three Guineas, which is that the domestic enslavement of women produces the fascist at the head of the country. That is Woolf's point. Do ever the women in this room forget this. Once Helen understands this dualism, she is able to remember and reinterpret her past. Blah, blah, nonsense. From this revisionary perspective, blah, blah. I'm not going to read this rubbish. It's all about reconciliation. I don't buy it. Let's end with the last lines to show you how complicated her work is and why I don't understand it. Helen's redefined innocence is only the first step, however, and it's not an innocence. I do not think HD is dumb enough to have ever believed in the idea of innocence, but never mind. In understanding the central mystery, the dialectical interactions of love and war, love becomes death, violence becomes love in the mystery of the Trojan War. In the hieroglyphic meeting of Helen and Achilles on the shores of Egypt, heavily influenced by Ambalain's writings on the Kabbalah. I don't read the Kabbalah. De Rougemont's interpretation of the Cathar heresy. What on earth is the Cathar heresy? Cathar sounds close to a place called Kaithal in Haryana. And the Moravian mystery of Zinzendorf. Who the hell is Zinzendorf? How much research will a PhD on HD take? HD's transcendent moment embodying the healing synthesis of opposites, no healing synthesis, joins other modernist myths of wholeness like T.S. fucking Eliot's in the Four Quartets. Give me a break. Quote. While I do not agree that HD's version of wholeness is anything like Eliot's, indeed she doesn't have a version of wholeness, you can see why Helen in Egypt was too intimidating a text for me to have chosen. I have read it several times, I barely understand it. So let's take some poems instead, the ones I've handed out to you. Read them with me because I'm not equipped to read them on my own. Here too, I want to move away from the standard Gobar feminist reading of second wave feminism. Yes, these poems are about reclaiming women's voices, blah, 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 women's voices, agency, nonsense. But much more importantly, these poems are about something else. What is that something else? That's what I want to end this talk on by reading. I don't know how much time we have. We have actually a lot of time. Well, so we have about 45 minutes to discuss 2 poems. It's too complicated. We have only 45 minutes. Let's not push. Although and you have something to say about any of these poems. Like I don't want to read Leda. What she's doing with Leda is fantastic. I don't think it's a reconciliation of dualism though. I think it's something else. So on Leda, I want you to just tell me what you think is going on. Is it like the poetry encyclopedia is saying a reconciliation of dualism, or is it something else? I'd like to read Cassandra, but for the moment, let's begin with my favorite poem, which I really like a lot, which is Eurydice, and the last poem, Demeter. Now, you both know these stories, right? Demeter has gone to search for her daughter, who basically, has been abducted, and Eurydice is, of course, doomed to be enslaved in stone forever because this stupid man turns, right? He turns and he looks at her, and it's gone. So anyway, let's read Eurydice. Okay? Meera, will you read it for us actually, because you're HD, not I.